Now, the American Gunsmithing Institute presents another instructional video on firearms design, operation, maintenance, and repair.
Hi, I'm Bob Dunlap and welcome to the Armor's course on the Ruger single action revolvers. And I think I'm going to start with some history of Bill Ruger and the company that he founded, or he and Alex Sturm founded. It's an interesting company, and Bill Ruger was an interesting man. He and I had some things in common, or have some things in common, because he had a great love of firearms, and so do I, and he had a great love of cars, and so do I. He was very intelligent. I'm fairly smart, but he was a lot smarter than I was. In many ways, I have to admire him. And I have a friend at the Ruger plant who's the head of the service department, and he and I are quite good friends. I'm glad I know him. Thanks to the Ruger company, we have a cutaway that we're going to use in this program. It's actually a factory cutaway. The Ruger company started, of course, with Bill Ruger, and he made a little company, made some tools, and the company didn't do too well. And he had a college friend by the name of Alex Sturm, and I guess Alex's wife's family had some money, and she put some money up, and they started a new company, which became the Sturm Ruger company. And Bill Ruger was very, very clever, very smart, and was always inventing this and that, and he was the first American, of course, to build a firearm frame in two halves of sheet metal stamped out and weld them back together, weld them together. So he had one, and then the other side of the mirror image of it. Put some doodads in it, welded together, and he had a frame. Of course, the Italians had done it with a Glicenti, and a few others had done it before, so it wasn't a new and novel approach, but he was the first American to do it, and it was extremely successful. Now, he and Alex started this company, and he and Alex were both very smart, had a lot of high-quality tastes. And, of course, Alex died young in 1951. So the company started in 1949, and Alex died of hepatitis in 1951, which left the Sturm Ruger company mostly Ruger at that point, although Alex's wife, I think it's Pauletta, continued on, kind of a silent partner in the company, and I don't know for how long, but quite a while. A lot of the information that, if you're interested, a lot of information is in the book that was loaned to me by the Ruger factory, and it's written by R.L. Wilson, who also wrote the history of Colt. It's called Ruger and His Guns, The History of the Man, the Company, and Their Firearms, and it's really quite good. If you're interested in the history of firearms, and in particular the history of Ruger, why, snap this book up. It's certainly worth having. It's, I think, $67, and I'm going to buy a copy myself. I do like it. Anyway, the company was started, and they started producing the novel automatic pistol called the Standard Automatic. And there's a picture of it here in the book. This is the gun that got the company started. And that started in 1949, and this gun was really something because it was a little bit cheaper than anything else on the market. I think High Standard had the Duramatic. This gun looked like a Luger. It was called a Ruger. It worked. It really worked. It held up well, didn't break very often, and was 25 cents, if I remember right, 25 cents less than the High Standard Duramatic. It sold very well, particularly after the war, because in 1949 there were no new guns available for a long time during the war, from the 40s on, early 40s. And so this gun was inexpensive, relatively speaking, and it worked, and it was selling like crazy. When you look at the picture of the Standard Automatic, the gun that started it all, it has a grip in the picture, and the grip has a red eagle in it. That was changed after Sturm's death to a black eagle. So you can know that if you see a red eagle on a Ruger Standard Automatic, that was made prior to Alex Sturm's death. Now in 1953, they came out with a single action 22 rimfire called the Ruger Single 6. You notice on the picture of the single six, the old model single six, which is the first one, came out in 1953. The loading gate is not the conventional shaped gate that we have on single action revolvers now, and it was like on the old Colt single action Army. It's a flat gate. I don't know why he did it. It was not very attractive. He didn't have it very long, and he switched to the conventional shaped gate. But in this picture, you'll see the original version with the flat loading gate. It also has the Black Eagle on the grip because it came out in 1953, and Alex died in 1951. I'll give you a brief history of sort of the lineage of the firearms, the chronological order of the firearms as they're produced by Ruger. Now, Ruger produced a few other things in very small quantities besides just firearms. But in 49, of course, came the standard automatic, and short followed almost immediately afterwards, but the target version, which is called the Mark I. Then in 53, the single six came out. In 55, the Black Hawk, which is a center fire gun in .357 Magnum. Then the Bearcat, which is a smaller version of the single six and .22 rimfire. Then in 59 came the Super Black Hawk, which is a bigger version, 44 mag. Of course, they had the 44 mag before that, but the larger gun with adjustable sights, and it was pretty popular. In 1960 came the 44 Magnum carbine. Now, that was quite a gun, and actually, well, I remember when it came out, I was working for Sims Hardware at the time as a gunsmith, and they loaned me one to take out and test fire, and I went shooting with it out in the country where I used to live as a kid. Had a very good time. I really liked the gun, and the funny thing is I've never owned one. I've never owned one myself. In 1963 came the Hawkeye. It was a single-shot center-fire pistol. It came in a .256 Winchester. Really good idea, because basically it was a Thompson Center contender, except that it was a pivot breech single-action pistol. It was not a revolver, it was a single shot, and shot a nice, fast center-fire 25 caliber bullet. To notice in the picture that it looks like a single-action revolver. Basically, it was a single-action revolver, except the cylinder only pivoted for about a fifth of a rotation, enough to open, expose a loading platform, if you will. You pushed the ejector rod, kicked out the empty, slipped a new round in, and pushed the cylinder, rotated it into lock position. That lined the firing pin up with the back of the case with the primer, and when you dropped the hammer, it hit the firing pin and fired the gun. So basically the single action revolver, except that the cylinder became a breech block. I think if Ruger made this gun today with a light, fast-moving hammer, they would give the contender a real run for the money. I don't know if they ever will, but it was a good idea. It just came out a bit too soon. But then we do that a lot, don't we? Anyway, after the Hawkeye came another very famous gun, and still the mainstay, but when this gun came out, it was phenomenal. It had a rotary magazine, it held 10 shots, and it didn't hang down like a banana sticking out of your little .22. It was a 10-22. That gun just really went nuts. Everybody wanted one. They were hard to get for a couple of years after they started producing them. And it's still one of the best automatics around, automatic .22s, made in this country at least, and it's not terribly expensive. And I have several of those, so it's got to be a good gun if I have several. And this is the gun that got Ruger Company really in the .22 rifle business. A lot of gun for not a whole lot of money. Then in 1966 came the #1 and the #3 single-shot center-fire rifles, somewhat patterned after a high wall, but it's not that close a connection. Nice-looking gun. Actually, I like them. I don't own one, but I'm not a fan of single shots too much unless they're muzzle loaders, so I'd rather have a semi-automatic. But it is a nice gun. It's strong. Comes out in lots of calibers, and you can make them in even bigger calibers than a lot of people have. It's a nice-looking gun. It's probably the prettiest single shot of any of them, I think, but then I have funny taste. In 1968, 2 years later, came the Model 77, which is a bolt-action center-fire rifle. Then in 1969-70, Bill Ruger, as I said earlier, liked cars. He decided to make one. Bill Ruger wanted to diversify his business, so he decided to get into manufacturer of automobiles, and he actually produced 2 of these cars. It came at a time when the United States government was getting into automotive industry's brainwork, shall we say, and started telling, or thinking about telling, what we could and could not do, what we had to have on cars. And Bill Ruger kept waiting and wondering and trying to see to it that his cars would comply. And he finally said it just too much hassle. But he has 2 cars, and apparently both of the cars still exist. The cars were kind of unique. They held 4 people, 2 in the front, 2 in the back. The body was basically one piece of fiberglass with apparently aluminum cast doors. The cast brass radiator shell had been chrome plated. The whole car was covered in naugahyde. I shouldn't say that. All of the fiberglass of the car was covered in naugahyde. Had a Ford 427 in it with, I think, 425 horsepower, more or less. It was a nice, fast little car. Held 4 people in relative comfort, apparently quite a bit of comfort. The back seats were big enough for real adults. But he decided not to build them. So there are 2 Ruger cars in existence. And liking cars as I do, I'd sure as hell like to have one of them. Never going to happen. Anyway. After the car, in 1977 came the first double-action center-fire revolver. It was the Security 6. In 1972, the old Army, which was a single-action revolver, converted basically to muzzleloader, percussion cap muzzleloader. In 1973, it converted all of the single actions to new model. And we'll get into that a lot more later, but what it was incorporated a safety system that made the guns much safer. And when we get into this, you'll understand why they did it and why it's a good idea. In 1975, the Mini 14 came out. In 1977, their over-under shotgun came out, the red label. In 1979, the Red Hawk double-action revolver came out. Now that was a large-framed double-action revolver. In 1980, Bill Ruger developed, or I shouldn't say developed, but designed a yacht called the Titania. Had an aluminum hull, which was black. Anyway, the yacht was designed by Bill Ruger and built by the Robert Directors, I probably messed that up, Boat Works. It had an aluminum hull, which was black, and then the top was, I don't know what it was, but it was made to Bill's specifications. It was apparently different in its layout, so that the crew and the crew had easier access to their quarters, and the people who were on the boat for pleasure had easy access to fishing and the stuff that they would be doing. Apparently different from most yachts of the day. And that's 1969, 1970. I don't know who owns the boat now. Someone must. It's got to be a famous boat. It's called the Titania. That was 1980. 1982, the Mark II pistol, automatic pistol came out. That replaced the standard automatic. It was a new upgraded version of it. In 1982 came the Ranch rifle. Also in 1982, the old model single action safety conversion came out. We'll talk about that more later, but that's when they converted or made available a conversion to convert the old style single actions to the modern style that has an inbuilt automatic safety. In 1983, the .357 Maximum revolver came out. There's a lot of problems with the Maximum, and Ruger pretty well solved most of them, so that you had an extremely hot .35 caliber cartridge, and it didn't cut the frame to pieces. Well, not too bad. In 1983 also came out the 77-22. Now here's a neat little bolt-action 22, which is probably the, well, not probably, it is the best bolt-action 22 made in America today. And I'm sure a few other gun companies won't agree with me, but I do like it. It's nice looking and it works, and it has a rotary magazine. It's just neat. 1985 came the GP100 double-action revolver, smaller version of the Red Hawk. In 1986, the Super Red Hawk double-action revolver came out. In 1986, a version of the single action came out called the Beasley or Beasley, had a more curved grip. Was made originally, the Colt Beasley was made for the Beasley matches in England, but it has an odd shaped grip and some people really like it, and Ruger brought it out. In 1985, the P85 came out. That was a center fire double action auto pistol, which was Ruger's first, of course, but by then double action auto pistols were gaining widely in popularity. In 1988, the SP101 came out. That was an improved version of the double-action revolver. In 1990, the Model 77 Mark II came out. And also in 90 came out the Model 7722, the 7722 Magnum, the 7722 All-Weather, I should say, and the 7722 Magnum. In 1991, the Mini 30 came out. In 1992, the Hunter Super Blackhawk came out, or Super Blackhawk Hunter came out. Also in 92 was the 2245 automatic pistol, the Magnum Express bolt-action rifles, the Mark II Target bolt-action rifles, the Sporting Clays over-under shotgun. A busy year for Ruger in bringing out new models and new versions. In 1993, the Vaquero came out. That was for cowboy shooting because it looks more like an old Colt single-action Army revolver, and it's extremely popular right now. Also, in 1993 came the P93 automatic pistol, and then they also brought out the new Bearcat in that year, 1993. So it's also a good year for Ruger. 1994, the 7722 Hornet came out, and there's one right there. That's my rifle, and I do like it. In 1994 also came out the MP9, something most of us won't own, or will never own. I wouldn't say we wouldn't want to, but something most of us will never own because it's a 9mm submachine gun. Also in that year, in 1995 was the 28 gauge over-under, and also in 1995 was the Woodside over-under. And I stopped at 95 because I haven't kept abreast of things too much, so I have to admit that. Anyway, that's a brief history of Ruger up to 1995. It's a pretty active gun company, and they've done extremely well. And of course, Bill and Alex were told that they couldn't do it. Now, they started with 50 grand, which of course in 1949 was a lot of money. But the tooling to make the pistol would cost much more than 50 grand today. The tooling to make the magazine would probably cost $50,000 today. And they did it. They started a company with $50,000 and a very good idea and an inexpensive way to make a gun, and it flew. And they made a lot of money on each standard automatic that they sold. By the time they got the first guns ready to sell, they were out of money. But the guns sold and kept selling and kept selling. They made money on them, and you know what they are now. Frankly, they're the biggest gun company. I think they're the biggest gun company in the United States, volume-wise, currently. They're certainly the biggest gun company that makes everything, because I don't think any other gun company in America makes rifles, shotguns, and pistols. I don't think any other company does. It's a real success story, and it's too bad that Alex Sturm didn't live to see it grow and flourish. I don't think the company would have changed much. Bill Ruger ran the company from the start, and Alex and his wife were okay with that apparently. And Bill had a lot of good ideas because his company has just shown we Americans that, you know, it's still a place that we can get ahead with a few bucks, and it doesn't take a lot. We can set the world on fire. And basically, the Sturm Ruger company did. We'll get into showing you some of the guns, and then we'll get into the things, the realities about single-action revolvers and the conversion unit that Ruger came up with. When I was a young man, or actually an old boy, before I was actually a young man, I guess, why, I tried making my own guns and modifying this and that. And I converted a Crosman pump-up to a CO2, and then I converted it to something else and it blew up. I forget what exactly, but anyway, to ruin my Crosman. I also made some various muzzle-loading cannons and things like that. And I designed a couple of guns that, had I built them, probably would have blown up. But Bill Ruger took a '99 Savage and converted it to semi-automatic. And then he tried to sell it to Savage and get a job at Savage, and that didn't work out. And I think he tried at Remington, if I'm not mistaken, and that didn't work out. But he went to Auto Ordnance, and they liked him. And he went to work for Auto Ordnance first. It worked out pretty well for him, I guess, all in all, except he realized that he's not going any place there. But he got there at a good time when the war had just started or about to start, and they were making a lot of stuff, Thompsons for various countries in the conflict already. And anyway, Bill Ruger got started because he invented something that kind of worked. He modified a Savage 99. My inventions didn't work, and I never got to work for Auto Ordnance. But also, the pictures that we show you throughout this video, for the most part, I think every one of them, or most of them, will have been taken from R.L. Wilson's book on Ruger. I highly recommend that if you like the history and you like the history of Ruger and want to know more about Bill himself, and he was quite a man, I would suggest you buy the book and read it. It's a good read. It's very interesting. I have some heroes in the gun industry. My favorite hero is, of course, John Browning, and I think he was an absolute genius. He did a lot of things, but his abilities to understand new systems in firearms are just unreal. And let's face it, no one else has designed guns that have lasted as long as John Browning. Another man who I really respect and admire was Oscar Mossberg of O.S. Mossberg and Sons, and that company still exists too, or also. He was very smart, brilliant man, and invented several things. One of the things he did was he actually got sheet metal stamping process down kind of pat, and was the first to use sheet metal stamped sheet metal parts in firearms. And of course we copied it, and the automotive bodies or car bodies are now stamped out, but he got the process perfected for us and used his stamped sheet metal parts in the guns that he manufactured. Bill Ruger was also a very intelligent man, and in his time, before they started investment casting, why, the Italians were probably the best investment casters in the world. And thanks to Bill Ruger, we now are, or were, and Bill Ruger, of course, a lot of these parts are investment cast, and he did start a company called Pine Tree Casting, which he owned until probably 10 years ago, or so when he sold it. Was one of the very best investment casters in the world. So Bill Ruger, although invented a few things and perfected a lot of things, but he also has to be given credit for bringing the world's best investment casting processes to this country. I had to give him respect for that. I always did admire him for that. And the fact that he had enough history and knowledge of the old guns that he would incorporate the good ideas in his guns. And for the most part, he's done a very, very good job. Anyway, laid out on the table, I have a few of the variations of the guns, the single-action guns that he's made. One of the more popular ones now, of course, is the Vaquero, because of cowboy shooting. And you notice how much this looks like a single-action Army Colt. It's not a Colt, it's a Ruger, and internally it is a Ruger. And of course, it's a new gun, so it has the safety built into it. And you can see it here, but we'll get into that more later. If the trigger is not pulled and the transfer bar isn't up, it can't fire. This is a new gun. Now, another version of it in stainless steel, this is still a Vaquero, is stainless steel Vaquero with a short barrel. They didn't have stainless steel when the cowboys were out there roaming the woods in the 1880s, but we have it now. Then we have, and this is the gun we're probably going to do the work on, we have just a regular old standard Black Hawk and 357 Magnum. I think this is 41 mag. This is 41 mag. And this is the one we're going to work on because it's out of time and has several minor problems that we'll correct on screen. This is a new style single action, or single six new style. I like this gun. I think that this is a neat little 22. Of course, the automatic's better, but then I'm new fashioned. This one is interesting in that this is an old style gun that's had the conversion put in it to make it safer. It has the transfer bar. If the trigger is not pulled, the firing pin cannot stick out. And this is a nice gun loaned to us from the owner of the Surplus Center in Coos Bay. This is an early single-six convertible 22 mag, 22 long rifle, and this one has not had the conversion unit put in it. You notice how it sounds and feels when you cock it compared to the one with a conversion unit in it. But the two feel good, just like a Colt feels good, a Colt single action feels good. These two feel good. Now we take a new gun, doesn't have a conversion unit in it, but it has a transfer bar. It doesn't have the same feel. I don't know what it is. So the old guns feel better, even with a conversion unit in it. I think that they feel better. We have in front of us here two single action Rugers. This is a 22 that's been unaltered. This is the center fire that has been altered. Same basic gun with some different parts in it. Now in 1973, Ruger went to or offered this conversion system. Now let's talk about single actions for a minute. And this is typical of a single action. Let's call it a Colt. And the Colt, why the hammer has a firing pin built into it. When the hammer's all the way down, the firing pin protrudes, hits the primer, makes it go off. In a safe notch, the firing pin is retracted and cannot touch the primer. In the load notch, the cylinder stops down, out of the way, the cylinder is free to revolve. The hammer's kind of locked in place. Kind of, I said. In full cock, of course, if you pull the trigger, the hammer will fall. There's no transfer bar. Now, a transfer bar is simply a piece of metal that comes up between the hammer and the firing pin. Now, if we take a look at this hammer, you notice the difference in the shape right here? There's a notch in the hammer. This one has a transfer bar, and this is the transfer bar right there. You notice that it's in front of the firing pin, or behind the firing pin. If I pull the trigger, it raises slightly. The hammer will hit the transfer bar in this section right here, right here, and pushes the transfer bar into the firing pin, makes it protrude, and fires the gun. Now if we release the trigger, see it drop down?
Yes, stop.
So that if I hold the trigger and the hammer falls, it does not drop. But if for some reason it's not cocked, the transfer bar is no longer behind the firing pin. Whereas when the hammer falls, this portion of the hammer right here hits the frame and stops its fall. It stops against that section. With the trigger pulled, the transfer bar is in between the firing pin and this section here of the hammer. This section of the hammer hits the transfer bar and pushes it into the firing pin and fires the gun. But if the transfer bar is not there, as it is now, this void in the hammer is so great that it cannot touch the back of the hammer, the back of the firing pin. It will not protrude, does not fire. Now, the problem with a single action, or with any gun that have to have positive firing pin protrusion, and because in the case of the Ruger and many, many guns made today in single actions and unsingle actions, double action revolvers sometimes, the firing pin is very light. That means that it won't get enough energy from the hammer on its own to carry forward like on a .45 automatic and fire the round. It must have the mass of the hammer behind it to give it enough energy. So it has to have what we call positive firing pin protrusion. When the hammer's down, the trigger's pulled, the firing pin protrudes and would be in a primer if it could be. If it was loaded, it would hit the back of a primer. Now, in the old days of percussion, the revolvers, most of them, had a section on each revolver or in the gun, the frame, and the hammer, but usually on the cylinder itself and the hammer. So that after you loaded the gun, you'd put the gun halfway in between the two loaded rounds, and there's a notch or a peg that was made up with the hammer, and the cylinder could not and would not revolve, and that was a carry safe position. Over time, and the single action Army Colt was one of the first to kind of get away from this. Now, what the design of the Colt was is that you're supposed to put it in between two rounds. The firing pin is set between the two rims and would sit stationary, and it worked pretty well. But if you bumped it or brushed it hard, it would index underneath primer lock up than if you bump the hammer, it'd fire. So of course we hear the stories about, well, you'd put a $10 bill in one and carry 5 loaded rounds and a $10 bill wadded up in the empty chamber, and that way if you got killed, there's burial money. But let's face it, if you shot a black powder cartridge out of this chamber, and in this chamber there was a paper bill, it would burn up. So you burn up your burial money, so they just throw out in the yard, I guess, and let you just decompose on your own. Anyways, that's a fallacy. I don't think anybody really did that. Besides, they probably figured that if they had one more round, they wouldn't have to die anyway. I don't know. Anyway, people started putting it in the safe notch. Misnomer. That's not the safe notch. Single actions of the early design, and this is typical of single actions of the period, the trigger is relatively thin. And if you carry it, cylinder indexed up, loaded, hammer in the so-called safe notch, and you're practicing your fast draw, and it slips out of your hand and lands on its hammer, it will very possibly break the trigger or break the trigger pin and discharge. Now, there's a case of a guy, and this tells you how we have dumbed down as a race. There was a guy in this area who had an imported single-action .357 Magnum revolver. And he carried it hammered down, loaded, in the door of his truck. Now, in Oregon, lots and lots of people have carry permits, so this is not so unusual. I think it's right now it's about 1 person in 25 has a carry permit, and it might even be more than that. Anyway, he opened his door one day and the gun fell out, landed on the hammer and went off. Well, I'm so smart, I don't go by the rules. I won't leave it under an empty chamber, or I won't leave it in between two. I'll just put it back in the door and forget about it, which he did. Went to buy a pack of cigarettes. Now, of course, it doesn't matter because he had died of cancer, whether this happened or not, but as he opened the door, the gun fell out, hit on its hammer, and wasted his little carcass. Went up through his body and hit his heart and killed him. It wasn't really the gun's fault. It was his fault. He didn't know safe gun handling. But Ruger was well aware of the fact that people are buying guns who don't have enough up here to coming out of the rain. This guy should have known that, hey, if it falls on the hammer, it's going to go off. I got to do something about that. Well, what Ruger did is they came up with a conversion unit to convert the old style guns that were conventional in design to the new style guns that have a transfer bar. Now, Bill Ruger did not invent the transfer bar, but he sure put it to good use. The transfer bar was invented by someone who doesn't get much credit, and in fact his guns generally aren't well touted, although I think very highly of them. They're an awful lot of gun for the money, but he doesn't even get credit for it. But the transfer bar was invented by Oscar Mossberg when he worked for Ivor Johnson Arms and Cycle Work in Pittsburgh, Massachusetts in about 1885. 100 years or so before its time. Let's face it, the Ruger came out with the transfer bar in, I think, 1970, I think, if I remember right. So about 85 years before its time, really, the transfer bar came out, invented by Oscar Mossberg. But Bill Ruger certainly put it to good use. And what he did, and we have a poster on the back here that tells about what Ruger would like you to do and tells you about the conversion unit. But what it does is it went to the new model system, basically. It converted a old-style single-action revolver of conventional design to the new, safe transfer bar system. And this is it. You can see it right here. And this is Ruger's asking you, request to please send the gun in. And that's what they want you to do, is to send the gun to them. Now you contact the Ruger company in Southport, Connecticut. It's 0 Lacey Place, Department OM, Southport, Connecticut, 06490. And tell them what you have, and they will send you instructions on how to send the gun to them. Now, once the gun is there, It will put in the new style conversion unit and send the gun back to you post-paid. You must send the gun to them and pay the postage for it. But you have to contact the factory first, get instructions, then send the gun to them, and they will then convert it and send the gun back to you, and they'll also send you back the original part. So that the originality of the gun, like this nice old convertible single 6 here, will not be ruined. You still have the parts, so for collector's value, you can still go back to the original, and frankly, they'll have more collector's value because you have the new conversion in the gun and you have the original system, which will increase the value of the gun rather than decrease it. Now, if you lose the conversion unit or you lose the original parts, that's a different story. You need to have both together. But once this is done, then the gun is quite safe. I'm not going to say it's 100% because any gun can go off. If you put it in the fire when it's loaded, it's going to go off. So no gun is 100% safe, but yes, it is extremely safe. What they've done, of course, is taken out these parts and put in these parts. And here's the transfer bar, and it requires a new style center pin or base pin that has a spring-loaded plunger in it to keep the transfer bar back so that it will clear the firing pin when you cock the gun. Has a hammer that works off the trigger to carry it up to make the whole system work. Has a new cylinder stop and a new cylinder stop spring. It's a well thought out conversion. I like the way it feels. And something else, I'm old-fashioned, but you see, on the new guns, you open the gate and you can load the gun. On the old guns, you had to put the gun on the load notch, and then the cylinder was free to rotate and you could load the gun. The cylinder stop was down. Then you opened the gate and loaded it or unloaded it, whatever. On the conversion unit, it's the same. You open the gate, it doesn't free the cylinder. You have to put it in the load notch. And that, I really do like that. I really do. I think Ruger did a really good job on this. So what I'm telling you is that if you have an old-style gun that does not have the conversion unit in it, contact Ruger, get the gun to them, and have the conversion unit put in. Let's face it, the liability, since Ruger has been advertising this for a long, long time now, since 1973, if you refuse to do it, and you sell the gun, or your kid gets the gun, and puts it in the safe notch, fully loaded, and drops the gun hard and it goes off and shoots somebody, you can be liable. So it's worth thinking about. Send the gun to Ruger, get it converted. And I really do like the way they did it. It feels right. They did a good job. We'll get into how the guns function, and we'll use the factory cutaway. This is the new style. If you know how the old style one works, we'll cover it briefly here, but also in the Colt single action, the Ruger was pretty similar in how the old style worked, except it uses a hammer plunger, and we still have the hammer plunger. So you'll see kind of how it works, except that on this one now, when you open the loading gate, the cylinder stop is pushed down. Anyway, basically in a nutshell how they work is when you cock the gun, the hand is attached to the hammer. When you cock it then, the hand rises, but you'll also notice down here, right there's the plunger on the hammer. See it push in. And barely in the picture right here, you can see the tail end of the cylinder stop. When you cock the gun then, the hand rises. You can see it raising. You also see the hammer plunger make contact with the cylinder stop and rotate it down. You see the cylinder stop rotating down here. Clears the cylinder notch. The cylinder is now free to rotate. The hand hits the cylinder ratchet pad, starts to rotate the cylinder. The hammer plunger has slipped off, or should I say the cylinder stop has slipped off of the hammer plunger and popped back up. It's not dragging on the cylinder. Hand continues to turn the cylinder till it indexes up. The cylinder stop then falls in the notch of the cylinder and locks it in place. Now you notice too that, now watch this area as I move the trigger. That moves out of the way of the full cock notch of the hammer. Now the hand's in the way so you can't really see it, but it's the full cock notch of the hammer. You pull the trigger, the hammer will fall. Now on the other side, we cock the gun so the hammer plunger hits the cylinder stop, rotates it out of the way of the cylinder, and then slips past, is now cocked. Pull the trigger, the hammer falls. The hammer plunger hits the tail end of the cylinder stop and telescopes into the hammer. It pops back out when it clears, goes home, ready for the next shot. That's how it sets itself. Otherwise, you see, if it couldn't move back in, it'd hit there and stub and the hammer wouldn't fall. But it telescopes into the hammer, allowing the hammer to rotate. When it clears, it pops back down, ready for the next shot. That's how that functions. When you open the gate on the new style guns, you see right here is a spring, and it rests on the gate itself, and the gate has a notch in it. When I push the gate open, it pushes that spring down. Now watch the spring. This leg will bend down or flex down, and right here on the cylinder stop is a knob or a bump. The spring will bump into it. See it? Now the cylinder is free to move. Close the gate, pops back up, locks the cylinder. That's how that does it. Is when the gate is opened, it pushes this spring down, which is resting on a cog or a void in the gate itself, pushes this down, that hits that peg on the cylinder stop, rotates it down out of the way, and now it's free to load. Hammer's still down. Can the hammer hit the firing pin? No. The transfer bar is down because the trigger's not pulled. That's basically how single action works. Now, if we pull the base pin out part way so that plunger no longer pushes the transfer bar back, watch when I try to cock the gun. At that time it slipped past. Catches right there. And point it down, probably catch really good. See, I can't even cock it now. It hits right there. It sticks. If I push the firing pin in, I can cock it. Or if I push the cylinder pin in, the base pin in, then the spring-loaded plunger pushes that out. See, this thing is now, the transfer bar is now spring-loaded with the plunger that's in the end of the base pin. On a single action, it's pretty simple. We have a system to activate the cylinder stop to push it down out of the way. We have a hand that turns the cylinder, and the cylinder stop pops back up and locks it. And we have a trigger that falls in the full cock notch of the hammer, holds it back. It also holds it in the safe notch if you have one, in the load notch if you have one, and of course the full cock. Now, the way the hand operates, and this is a two-stage hand, is that when the hammer is cocked, the hand rises with the hammer, or rises because it rotates with the hammer. And the first shelf on the hand rotates, hits and rotates the cylinder on this notch, the ratchet. Sorry. The hand rises and the top of the hand hits the ratchet pad and starts to rotate the cylinder. About halfway through or so, you can see it later, you can see the second stage starting to make contact with the ratchet pad, and when the gun is cocked, the second stage or shelf on the hand is now resting underneath and pushing on the second ratchet pad, so that it's a two-stage system. There's the second stage right there. You see it's pushing on the ratchet pad. Now it starts with the first stage at top. That hits the ratchet pad, rotates it. It starts to slip past, and the second stage tucks underneath the second ratchet pad, continues to rotate the cylinder, locks it up. Now when the gun is cocked, the second stage of the hand is underneath the second ratchet pad, and if you push it down hard like that, what stops the hammer from going back any farther is that the hand, which has the raise with the rotating of the hammer, pushing the ratchet pad, the cylinder is locked by the cylinder stop and it cannot turn, so the hammer cannot go back any farther. When you pull the trigger, of course, the hammer falls, the hand sweeps down past the ratchet pads, doesn't matter, they're locked in place by the cylinder stop, so the cylinder can't turn. Falls forward and it comes to rest, and now if you cock it again, the top of the hand hits the first ratchet pad, the second shelf of the hand hits the second ratchet pad and finishes the cocking, rotating cycle. On the new style system, when you cock the hammer, of course the hand is attached to the hammer. But also, there's a shelf, if we want to call it that, a shelf on the hammer. When the hammer is cocked, there's a leg on the trigger that holds the transfer bar, and it is picked up by the hammer and forces the trigger to move back. That raises the transfer bar. So that although the hand is attached to the hammer, the trigger is semi-independent of it, and the transfer bar is attached to the trigger. If the trigger is pulled, the transfer bar rises, gets behind the firing pin, and the hammer falls, it can fire. But if the trigger is not pulled back by the hammer, or if the trigger is free to move forward as the hammer falls, you see it dropping. At this point, the hammer could, of course, fall and hit the frame, but the transfer bar is lowered so much that it will not hit the firing pin. The firing pin does not protrude in this mode. And so what happens when you cock the gun is that the trigger does, in fact, hit the hammer raises the trigger, which raises the transfer bar. When the trigger is pulled, the hammer falls, the trigger is still pulled, the transfer bar is up, the gun can fire. When you release the trigger, the transfer bar drops. So in this mode right now, trigger pulled, hammer down, the firing pin is protruding. The only change we make is we let go of the trigger. The trigger withdraws because the hammer is no longer pulling it back, and the transfer bar drops with it, clears the firing pin, and then if it should be on a live round and you drop it on the hammer, it cannot fire. Can't make contact with the firing pin. Also on the other side of the cutaway, you'll see how the cylinder stop return system works. It's a spring-loaded plunger that lives in the trigger guard. It's right here. You cock the gun, you see it come down. Spring-loaded plunger pushes the cylinder stop or the ball of the stop into the notch of the cylinder and locks it in place. In the frame, behind the hand itself, and you can see it right here, the spring-loaded plunger, that's the hand spring. Now frankly, when Ruger came up with this system, he did a much better system than the Colt, which is the old two-bladed leaf spring that was always breaking. These springs hardly ever break unless you take it apart and screw it over yourself, and most of us do that from time to time. You take the grip frame off, this spring for this plunger will stick out. If you put the grip frame back on, you can spoil the spring. Some guns, some single-action guns, have a screw behind it to lock it in place. The Ruger doesn't, and frankly most of the guns that are copies of this don't either. Anyway, that is the hand spring. It's a spring-loaded plunger in the frame, sticks out the back here. This is the cylinder stop spring and plunger that lives in the trigger guard. Now, I call this part a hand. Most gun companies call it a hand. Ruger calls it a pawl. If you want to get technical, it is a pawl. But I just grew up with it a hand because I was born before this gun was, and so my way is right, I'm sure. Anyway, I'll say that till I die, I guess. Before we start the actual disassembly, reassembly of one of the guns, I want to spend a couple of minutes talking more about the transfer bar safety that's in the new models of the single actions. I have here a Vaquero, but they're all the same. I've taken the cylinder out of it, and you can see the firing pin sticking out. I let go of the trigger, it pops back in. The reason that works is that when the gun is cocked, the trigger is held back by the hammer. The transfer bar is up behind the firing pin. You can see it there. When I pull the trigger, and the trigger is now pulled and held with your finger so the hammer will fall, the hammer falls, it hits the transfer bar, and the transfer bar is driven into the firing pin. And so you see it sticking out as you do. And you see it sticking out as you do now. When I let go of the trigger, the transfer bar is pulled down. Clears the firing pin, the hammer can't touch it. Okay, now the trigger's pulled, the hammer's fallen, it's hit the transfer bar and is holding the transfer bar forward, the transfer bar has hit the firing pin and pushing the firing pin out into the standing breech of the gun, and if it were loaded with the cylinder in it, it would have discharged a round. When I let go of the trigger now, the trigger will return because the hammer is down, not holding the trigger back, and the transfer bar will be pulled down by the trigger as the trigger returns. Now when it does, it'll no longer be behind the firing pin, it'll drop down. There's a cutout area in the hammer that was being filled by the transfer bar. When the transfer bar drops down, the firing pin can pop back and won't be touching the hammer because there's a void in the hammer at that point. The firing pin now retracts, does not stick out. The gun is totally safe. You can drop it on the hammer very, very hard. You can hit it, it won't fire. About the only way you could get it to fire by hitting the hammer is if you hit it so hard that you bent this part of the hammer back or pushed it into the frame, and that likelihood of that is so remote that it's virtually impossible. You would really have to be hit with a punch press of some kind, probably. Very hard. It's a very good safety, and remember that it was invented by a man who doesn't get a lot of credit for it. That was Oscar Mossberg back in the 1800s. It came of age in 1973, thanks to Ruger. Well, that pretty well wraps up the design and function segment of this tape. We might touch on a few tidbits here and there. Remember that my philosophy is that if you understand how the gun works, then you can fix it. If you don't understand how it works, you can trade parts and replace this and that until you finally get it to work if you're lucky. With that, we'll start on the actual disassembly of one of the guns. Well, for our first disassemble, we're going to use the factory cutaway. It's the same as any other new style guns, except that it's missing 4 screws in the grip frame, 2 here and 2 here. The only one that's left is this one. We'll take it out later. To take the gun apart, the first thing we do is cock it. Of course, make sure it's not loaded. If you feel safer, why take the cylinder out. Then put a pin, even a paper clip will usually do if it's stiff enough, put a pin through the hole in the hammer strut or mainspring guide, let the hammer down. That detensions it, so now the grip frame isn't under a lot of tension. And then I like to unhook the trigger spring. Now we'll get it this way then, on both sides. That just makes it detension, so it's a little bit easier to take off. Then I would take out the screws. First, we take out the 2 screws that are missing here, the 2 screws that are missing here, and of course this one. And what order you take them out in doesn't really matter too much. I can just lift off the grip frame. And here is the cylinder stop, plunger and spring. Don't lose them. With that off, then you can take out the pins. To take out the trigger retaining pin, you need to push this spring down because it retains it. There's a groove in the pin. You take a screwdriver or something and push that spring down. And I like to push it out notched in first. Then you punch out the hammer pin. You just got a groove in it. It's held in by the long screw that holds the grip frame on. Lift this mess out altogether. Now while we're here and got this apart, this is the hammer plunger. This is the piece that activates or deactivates the cylinder stop. And when you cock the gun, this makes contact with the cylinder stop, forces it to pivot out of the way, then slips down the end. Every time that the hammer returns, the hammer plunger is pushed in by the tail end of the cylinder stop, and it slips by and it snaps out. So that every time the hammer's cocked and then falls, this piece goes in and snaps out very hard. This piece is prone to breakage. It's held in by a little cross pin, which goes in this hole right here. I just now pushed it out. The hammer plunger and spring will now come out. There we go. There's the spring. The hammer's taken completely apart. If you're going to carry some spare parts for the Ruger single action at least, this is one I would carry because this is probably the most commonly replaced part that isn't ruined by mishandling. Because every time it snaps out, that cross pin stops this by hitting right here. They have a tendency to pull in half in this cutout section right here. When they pull in half, of course, they no longer deactivate the cylinder stop, and the gun can't be cocked, therefore the gun can't be fired. So if you have one of these spare and it breaks, you're not out of business. You can also make one out of a piece of spring stock. If you're familiar with Brownells, you can order a spring wire kit of the straight wire like this, and it comes in a diameter that fits this just perfectly. One of the pieces is that diameter at least. And all you have to do is cut it to length and cut the notch in it. I cut the notch first because I'm kind of spastic and can't measure too accurately, and then I just trim it to get the length I want. Generally speaking, the more of it that sticks out, the sooner the cylinder stop will start down. So if you have a gun for some reason that's timed late, if you make a new hammer plunger with a slightly longer, then it'll make contact with the cylinder stop a little bit sooner and make it start down a little bit sooner. So that if you have a ball that's not out fast enough and the hand hits it, you can do that to correct that. You can make a longer hammer plunger. If you aren't at this skill level yet and don't feel comfortable making it, why take it to someone who's really qualified that can make a hammer plunger, or just carry a hammer plunger, a spare one. Anyway, we've got this much of it out so far, and of course the cylinder stop and the spring that activates it or deactivates it on the opening of the gate come right out. We'll take out the hand spring and plunger. And you'll notice that this one has kind of a little kink in it. That's because somebody tried to put it together incorrectly. The spring was sticking out and they just slid the grip frame up. It's easy to do. This is kind of a tricky one to put back together. So I'm not going to condemn anybody for this. I've done it myself and I'll probably do it again. And it still works. It's not ruined. It just, if you did it much worse than that, probably would spoil it. To take out the cylinder, of course, and I'm sure you know how to do this by now, you simply press the base pin latch in, pull out the base pin, open the gate, lift out the cylinder. Now you've got the gate spring out already, so you just slip the gate out like that. You want to take the base pin out itself. In most models you have to take off the ejector system. One screw does that. And now the base pin can come out forward far enough to come completely out of the frame. Now, this is a spring-loaded plunger that's in the new style base pins since 1973. Sometimes this plunger will lose its, or I should say the base pin loses its grip on the plunger and the plunger will come out, and then the gun will get hard to cock because it pushes, when it's assembled, it pushes on the transfer bar and holds it back so that it will clear the firing pin as you cock the gun. Because otherwise, the firing pin will be sticking out like this and you cock the gun, this may stub on the firing pin. So this thing just puts pressure on it to hold it back so it'll always clear the firing pin when you cock the gun. If this comes loose and falls out, when you go to cock the gun, particularly when the muzzle's pointed down, it'll catch and you won't cock. If you catch it soon enough, you can find the parts. They usually fall down inside the inside of the gun, so if you take the gun apart, you might find this spring and plunger. You can put it back in, and then they just bumped it, and that's all you have to do is put it back in. You see right here where they bumped it? Well, you can push it back in and bump it again so it won't come out. Otherwise, if you've lost a spring and plunger, it's just cheaper to buy a whole new base pin assembly. Now to take the base pin catch out of the gun, we need to take a split screwdriver and unscrew this one side, this nut. And you put it in the nut side because the screw of the latch protrudes through. Take another screwdriver, put on the other side, and then unscrew this unit. Now the base pin latch assembly is out of the gun. It takes the ejector assembly apart, just slide the ejector rod out of the housing, pull the spring off, drop out the screw, it's apart. We'll take the rear sight apart and off of the frame. We'll take the rear sight blade out first. For that you're going to need a special tool. It's just a punch with one side ground off so it's flat, so it's half a circle. Take out the rear sight windage adjusting screw. And take our punch and insert into the rear sight housing and push the spring in, and then you can just push it forward and lift up its little back end. Rear sight is out. Rear sight windage adjusting spring is out, or rear sight leaf spring is out. Then to take out the rear sight housing or body, punch out the cross pin and unscrew the screw that's for the elevation screw. Screws out, rear sight body is off, and there are two springs in here. One stayed in the sight and one stayed in the frame. And that's the rear sight out of the gun. Now, there's another part that will come out, and that's the firing pin assembly. It's right here. It's held in by a cross pin, so there's a housing that holds it in place. The firing pin bushing. To take it out, so let's say you break a firing pin, to take this out, you have to drive out this pin. You just barely see it right there. It's contoured with the frame. When the frame is polished, that pin is polished down with it, so it's a match. To take it out, you come in from this hole right here, where the gate is, and drive that pin out. Once you do this, you can never put that pin in exactly the same. It'll show. So you take it out when you have to, otherwise you don't take it out, because to do it right, you'd have to refinish the frame to have it look okay. So in a normal clean and oil, you would not take the firing pin out. You simply dry it off good and put oil in it, clean it, and then dry it off good and put oil in it. You take it out when the firing pin is broken or too long or too short or something drastic like that, and just figure that you're probably going to refinish the frame at the same time. Okay, the gun is almost completely apart now except for the grip frame assembly, and we have that out of the gun. Lift out the cylinder stop spring and plunger, and then push forward on the mainspring and lift it out. And we can take the assembly apart if we want by pushing this down, and it goes back together a little bit harder than it comes apart, by the way. And then the trigger spring is still in the gun. The trigger spring is still in the gun. Punch out this pin and take out the trigger spring. It goes in like this. And it's now completely apart as far as you take it for bluing or major cleaning. We'll start on that shortly. The gun is apart, and I put it in a little tray. I'm going to show you how I clean a gun. It's going to be very unconventional. You don't need a lot of fancy equipment. You need the tools to take it apart with and put it back together with. You need a little tray or something to hold the parts in. You need a little bucket of water or your wife's sink or a sink. And you need something to clean it with. And I use two things. If I clean a gun in the house, I use oil eater because my wife prefers the smell of it over the simple green. If I clean it outside or in my own shop, I normally use the simple green because I prefer the smell of it. The two seem to clean pretty much the same. I might give a slight edge to the simple green, but it's slight. The oil eater is pretty good stuff. All right, so we select our chosen cleaner and spray the parts that are in the tray. Get them nice and wet. And I like simple green and oil eater because neither one of them seem to bother me, my hands. I don't seem to be allergic to them. Don't seem to have any side effects. Parts are just soaking. If it's really bad, I would have waited longer, but this stuff will take off the dried oil and cooked on grease and whatever else. And if it's really bad, you might have to do it twice, like a gun that hasn't been cleaned in 50 or 100 years, and Believe it or not, they do exist. We get them practically every week. We get some gun that hasn't been cleaned in its life. And so, of course, that takes more scrubbing because the oil is very old and oxidized and stiff and stuck. And once in a while, if it's combined with a little bit of rust, why, we might even take a soft wire brush and go after some of the worst parts. Anyway, I'm going to continue this process, just scrubbing each part and put it in the water. When it's done, why, I'll take them out and dry them off. And the next time you see this, why, we'll have the parts dried off and in the tray, ready to squirt some oil on them. Well, look at this, all clean and dry. There's a couple of ways you can dry them off after you wash them and rinse them. You can blow them off, or you can wipe them off by hand with something and put them in an oven at about 225 degrees for a short while, warm them up and get everything out. What you want to make sure, though, is that you get all the water out, because if you don't, it's been thoroughly degreased with the soap that you used, and it'll rust in the pocket of water. So make sure it's completely dry. This one is thoroughly dry now. Now we're going to hose it down with oil. And as most of you know, I really like Break Free, and I have it here in a spray container. Break Free works really well. It's a good rust inhibitor. It's a good lubricant, and it actually will take any dirt out of the pores and bring it to the surface. So it's a cleaner too. I prefer to clean the gun before I use the Break Free. Continued use of the Break Free will embed the Teflon into the pores somewhat, and the gun gets real slick. It is a good lubricant on top of everything else. Anyway, let's squirt everything down now. Like making a cake, you mix all the ingredients and stir it all up so everything's stuck with the flour. In this case, we're sticking it with oil. Now we'll wipe off the excess as we need it, and we'll assemble the gun. Well, it's all oiled and wiped down, and now we're going to assemble it. We'll start with the rear sight first. Drop our little spring in for the windage. Take our little tool. Now you notice, now not all rear sight blades will have this. There's a little bump on the rear sight blade right here. There's a matching notch in the rear sight body, and you have to kind of slip it in that notch. It kind of retains it so it can't fly out, because a weakness with the design, and it is a Colt design actually, the Colt Acro sight uses the same system, almost identical, is that it can, under heavy recoil, fly out, and in the .44 Magnum it has heavy recoil. So by doing this, it made it almost impossible for it to fly out. So it is an improvement. We put our tool in with the cut side, the flat side up, compress the spring, slip our rear sight slide in, pull the spring out, the tool out, and now we have the rear sight slide in the body. We'll put the screw in. I just put it in backwards, folks. Put the windy screw in. And I've pulled the rear sight slide back a bit so I don't have to detent it when I screw the screw in very much. That's pretty close to center. We'll put this in the frame now. Take our two rear sight springs and place them in the frame if they'll stay there. Now what we can do if we have trouble with this is we can take, I'll show you, take and put some grease, some heavy grease in these two little divots and put the springs in. We call it gunsmith glue, and it just holds the spring or whatever you want to do in place while you assemble the rest of it. And I might have to do that because these don't want to stay there. I think that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to go get some heavy grease, and so I'm going to put some gunsmith glue on this and put the springs in place. It'll just make assembly easier. Now the springs will stay in place while I put the rear sight assembly in place in the frame. I just put the screw in, and that'll kind of retain it, and I line up, put through the retaining pin. Rear sight is now on. Just check and make sure it's free. And one of the springs didn't fall over, and it didn't. So that's assembled correctly. We'll put the ejector housing on the barrel. And when we do that, we have to put in the we have to put in the base pin first because the ejector assembly stops it from coming out of the frame. So we'll put that in. And assemble the ejector assembly, which is the ejector rod and its spring. Put it in place on the barrel and frame, and put its screw in. There's something wrong, because that should be free and it's not. Oh, it is now. I had the loop of the spring out of place, is binding the ejector rod itself. And put in the base pin latch assembly. And we took it apart upside down, but the actual base pin latch goes on the right side of the frame. So I'm putting it on the left because it's upside down. Slip in the spring and start the nut. When it gets too stiff to turn by hand, you take your two screwdrivers, your split driver and your real screwdriver, there we have it, and it functions. You notice that as I assemble, I check it each time so that I know that I got that part in right. We'll now assemble the hammer. The hammer, of course, has just a hammer plunger in it. Hammer plunger assembly, so we drop in the hammer plunger spring. The hammer plunger. The notched part goes in the hole because this cross pin goes through the hole in the hammer and retains the hammer plunger. Start the pin, push the plunger in, push the pin through, and it's free. The pin is in place. We're happy. We'll assemble the grip frame assembly, and that's pretty simple. Put the trigger spring in place, and you see this hole in the grip frame right here. Its cross pin goes through that, but retains it. What I like to do on many of these things is I start the pin in the hole, and then I line up the spring or whatever it is that I have to go through, and I see visually then when it lines up, I can push the pin or screw through. Now that's assembled. Now the mainsprings tend to be pretty strong. This is kind of hard to assemble. You can wrap a rag around this, or you can put it in vice grips. Is what I'm going to do. And just push the vice grips down. It makes it much easier. I want to grip it pretty tight because you're going to have to push pretty hard. I'm pushing pretty hard. And we can slip this into the gun. The mainspring assembly goes in with it has kind of an arch, and it goes in kind of matching the arch of the grip frame. So this is the grip frame and its arch, and this is the mainspring that goes in the same way. So it kind of follows that arch. And it's in place. Now we need to assemble the trigger and hammer into the, or should I say the innards into the frame. When we assemble the frame, the first thing we do is put in the gate. And the gate spring. Then the cylinder stop. Now, I won't call all the parts the same as Ruger, so don't get excited. I'm just calling them by what I know them by, the more common terminology. But every manufacturer has some parts that have different names. I'm going to put in the pin for the cylinder stop trigger. The trigger's not in yet, but I'm going to put the pin through. And I put the pin through with the solid end in first, so I don't have to keep fighting the cylinder stops, the gate spring that latches into the pin here. With this notch, as I slide it through, it'll catch on the trigger, catch on the cylinder stop, it'll catch on the frame, it'll catch on the spring. But if I push it in this way and get it started, then it just kind of slides in on its own from then on. I think we've all been there. Now I've pushed the pin through until it's just about flush with the inner edge of the cylinder stop. Now that's assembled. Now I can take and roughly assemble the trigger, hammer, and transfer bar, and hand. So put it in, we'll put the transfer bar partway in, hammer, slide the two in together as a unit, sort of as a unit. Line up the hammer pin, put in the hammer pin. I know there's a specific side that the Ruger factory uses for this notch, but it'll work either way. The only thing you have to remember is that if you have all the screws for the grip frame, the long one is designed to go through and cross this notch so that the pin can't come out, it locks it in place. So remember how you put it in. I normally put it in so that the notch is on the same side as the notch of the trigger pin. So the hammer's in place. And what I kind of do in a case like this is I line up the holes and I just push it down. I push the pin through. So I can see from the back side, from the top side, when everything's lined up, and I just push from the back side where the pin is, it pushes it through. Now, as I continue to push, the notch in the trigger pin will line up with the spring, and the spring will pop in place and lock it in place. You see that locked in place. Now, the tricky part, probably the hardest part of the whole thing of assembling this gun, is getting the grip frame on without wiping out something. The spring for the cylinder stop goes in the trigger plate itself, or grip frame itself. The spring and plunger for the cylinder stop goes into the grip frame. The spring and plunger for the hand goes into the frame itself. It's the upper hole. You see it push on the hand right there? Now here's the trick. You have to put this on lining up the plunger and spring for the cylinder stop on the cylinder stop. Getting the hammer strut or mainspring guide in the notch in the back of the hammer. Getting the trigger spring on top of the back of the trigger. And missing the end of the spring sticking out for the hand. All basically at the same time. You're probably going to hear some cursing now, but I'm going to try to get all these lined up at the same time. The first thing I do usually is try to line up the hammer mainspring guide with the slot in the hammer, which I've succeeded in doing. You notice now that I have the grip frame on top of the hand spring. I have the plunger on top of the cylinder stop, and I kind of slide it together now. Now I'm going to have to pick up with a small screwdriver or punch the trigger spring and try to get it on top of the trigger. Oop, slipped off. I got the trigger spring on the trigger, I got the cylinder stop spring on the cylinder stop, I've got the mainspring strut almost in the hammer notch, and I've got the back strap or grip frame assembly behind the hand spring. So I just kind of slide it together. It is together. I can put in the screw or screws. I only have the one on this gun. I'll put it in. But normally I'd put in one of these first and then one of the back, top or upper back strap or grip frame screws. So normally then I would have several screws to assemble. Then I would pick up the trigger spring tails and put them on top of that pin with a groove in it on each side. Cock the gun, and that fell out, but you normally have to take it out. And now open the gate, put in the cylinder. And this gadget's really slick because you can tell immediately if it's loaded or not. You can tell if that yellow thing's in there and it ain't brass colored, can't have any room for cartridges in there, so it's not loaded. But don't mistake that for brass. If you see a bunch of brass cartridge cases in there, it's loaded, and they'll look kind of yellow too. And there we have it. Wasn't so bad, was it? Now let's take apart one of the earlier model guns with a conversion unit in it, because you'll see some of those too. Now we're going to disassemble a gun that has the conversion unit. So it's an old model gun with a conversion unit in it. This is kind of a neat gun because it's .30 carbine. So it's an old model gun in .30 carbine with been back to the factory, and so now it has the conversion unit in it. We'll take it apart. It comes apart pretty much the same way, but it's a little easier to reassemble. Once again, we caulk the gun, drop the pin through the mainspring guide, lower the hammer, and take out our screws. Screws like this would be good to have a electric driver. I've never been to the Ruger plant, but I'll bet you they use them there for assembly. I know that at Crosman plant they do. They can assemble an air gun in less than 45 seconds. Those guys are good. Actually, there's a gal I watched do it. Now, the trigger spring was in the mainspring grip frame of the new model. It's also in the grip frame of the old model, but it's a spring-loaded plunger that's right here. There's a slight difference there. The cylinder stop spring is this spring right here. We'll unhook it in a minute. And of course the hand spring lives right here. That's almost identical to the new model. To take it apart, we will take a screwdriver. I like to use one with a little hook in it like this. We'll hook this spring right here and pry it out. Now what we have, and you probably can't see it, I'll turn it so that maybe you can. There's a hole in the frame. I got the screwdriver hooked into it. It's drilled in here at a slight angle and it comes out the side, and this spring has a hook on it. When you put it together, now I'm going to have to turn it this way because I'm so terribly right-handed. You have it hooked up. You have it hooked up. Unhook it. It's unhooked. Take out the screws. Now so far everything's just like an old model. This one has been converted, so nothing's really changed. It's going to change here in a minute. Now, there's no sense in taking off the mainspring ejector housing or the rear sight. They're identical to the other gun we just took apart. Certainly looks pretty familiar, doesn't it? It's just an adaptation of the old model to the new model system, yet it still has most of the feel of the old model. And the gate doesn't disengage the cylinder stop. You put it in the load notch with a hammer, that disengages the cylinder stop, and you can rotate the cylinder and load the gun. Pretty similar. The nice thing about this is that if you will send the gun off and get it upgraded to the new system, they send you back the old parts, the gun will have a slight increase in collector's value because now you have the originals and you have proof, of course, that the gun's been to the factory and has the factory upgraded parts in it. So you have both. Secondly, you know that the liability won't be on you should you let the gun fall in the wrong hands and it goes off and hurts somebody. They could, in fact, get after you. This way, you're safe. I highly recommend that if you have an early model gun, an old style gun, that you send it off to Ruger and get it fixed. Remember, you contact them first, and then when they send you the information, you send the gun to them. And it's all post-paid back to you. You have to pay to send it to them, but after that it's all on them. They'll put in the upgrade, send the gun back to you, no charge. Now, we have a little something here that's different. Remember they replaced the cylinder stop? Now, the cylinder stop was activated by a hammer plunger on the old model gun and on the new model gun, but on the conversion unit it works like a Colt, and it works off a hammer cam. Lifts it up, slides off, springs over, snaps back into place as the hammer falls. I'm not going to go into detail on how to adjust this. It works like a Colt. If you really want to know, you can get the tape on the Colt and find out. Bear in mind, these parts are not readily available, so if you wreck it, you're going to have trouble getting a new one, or you're going to have a real qualified gunsmith fix what you've got left. So I would approach this with caution. Interesting thing about the an interesting thing about the Ruger cylinder stops is that really they don't give much problem. I think the most common broken part is the hammer plunger, and other than that, they time up pretty much well enough. If you have a timing problem with this one, there are ways to adjust it, but I've never encountered it. I really have never encountered it. On the guns that have a hammer plunger, once in a while they don't get out quite fast enough. You time the hand and it makes the cylinder start to rotate sooner, and the ball of stop hasn't gotten out and it gets kind of a catch in it. So sometimes we have to speed that up, and of course I told you earlier you do that by lengthening the hammer plunger or making a new one that's a bit longer. That makes contact with the cylinder stop sooner and gets it down out of the way a little bit sooner. You have to use some caution there, because if you make the hammer plunger too long, the hammer won't return. You'll know it right away. It's too long. What happens is, of course, when the plunger goes past comes up like that, and the cylinder stop comes back down like that, and the hammer plunger comes down here and telescopes. Well, the end of the tail of the cylinder stop is like this, and the plunger is designed to hit here, telescope in, and slip past. If it sticks out so far, it'll hit here and catch, and the hammer won't fall. It got stuck. You'll know. If you make it too long, you'll know. So with that word of caution, if you really have to know how to do it, then get the Colt tape, and it'll tell you how to do it, because it's the same as the Colt, basically. The only difference is that the spring is not as adjustable as it is on a Colt, and so the spring adjustment via the spring, which we don't do very often anyway, isn't really readily available on the Ruger, but everything else is the same. All right, to put it back together, we just do it in reverse order. Put the cylinder stop in place, put its screw through, okay, I've put the trigger somewhat in place with the transfer bar. I've started the hammer and the plunger, hammer and the hand. Try to keep them together and slide them in. Once they're in, line up the screw holes and put in the screws. Tighten them all down. Whoops, I forgot the spring for the cylinder stop. You do want to put that in. Remember that the leg that kind of sticks up at an angle this way goes toward the edge of the frame. That's hooked up the spring to the cylinder stop, and now the gun would normally cycle if I had a hand plunger in place. We put the grip frame back in place, and this is easier because we only have two things to line up, actually three. We've got to get the grip frame, clear the hammer plunger, we've got to get the trigger plunger behind the trigger, and we have to get the mainspring guide in the slot in the hammer, but it's easier than the other one. I got the slot, the mainspring guide in the slot. I've got the trigger plunger behind the trigger. And I've now got the handspring behind the grip frame, or in front of the grip frame. It's in. I put in a screw to hold it. I'm holding it with my fingers, you can probably tell through the trigger guard. I'm holding it toward the muzzle and toward the cylinder at the same time, this direction in other words. All the screws are in. Cock the gun and take out the cross pin that retained it. Seems to be all there. Here's an example of someone who over-tightened the grips. You notice the damage to this grip? They just kept screwing it down until they sucked the escutcheon through the grip, broke it out the back. To correct this, we put some glue in here and then drive that back down. And just to show you how simple it is, I'm going to do it. And I can assure you, I did not do this. I'm going to put some glue in this broken part of the wood. I'll try to blow it down into the edge of the cracks. Put some on the other side. Okay, wipe up the excess. And here's where the butchery comes in, I suppose. I worked the glue thoroughly in there. Now I have to clamp it till the glue sets up. So I'm going to put it in a clamp to hold it in that position. In a few hours then I will just unhook it, I'll take it out of the clamp and put it back on the gun. But I've worked the glue into it thoroughly and I've pushed the escutcheon back where it belongs. When it dries I just put it back on the gun and screw the grip screw in and it'll hold. We have here a tired old 41 Magnum Black Hawk. Interesting, is made in 1976, and on the barrel says made in the 200th year of American liberty, 1776, 1976. This gun's been around a little bit, and the cylinder is loose this way. I'm not going to fix that. It has a little bit of end shake. That's fore and aft movement of the cylinder. It's probably just barely out of spec. I'm not going to take that out, but I'm going to tell you how. But on a Ruger, it's very hard. And then it's out of time. It doesn't quite time up. You can see the cylinder stop is not quite locked up. Now it is. So it's timed just a little slow. We're going to stretch the hand to time it up. A single action is timed correctly, now not for fast draw, but for normal sporting use. When it's cocked, you have almost no overcock of the hammer. If it's timed up so that the trigger falls in the full cock notch, as the cylinder stop falls in the stop notch of the cylinder, then that's timed at the same time. That's timed correctly. But on this gun, the trigger's in. Now the cylinder stop fell in the notch, and we still move the hammer back quite a bit. They would stop almost simultaneously, so that when you cock the gun, it would come back and stop. You let it come forward, pull it back again. You might get a 1/16 of an inch, but you won't get the 1/4 of an inch at the spur that you're getting here. So we need to time it up. We're not going to replace the cylinder stop to take this out, but that's how I would do it. And I'm not going to take out the end shake, but I'll tell you how we're going to do that too. On most revolvers, the cylinder is held in place by usually the ratchet hitting the back of the standing breech, or an area of the standing breech of the frame itself in the frame window, and the gas ring or something that fits around the gas ring or beside the gas ring. In the Ruger, of course, the ratchet hits in the frame right here in this area, and the gas ring hits the frame in this area right here. And that holds the cylinder in the window so it has little or no fore and aft play. And you want 0 to 2 thousandths, basically. Now to correct that, depends on the gun, but the Rugers are corrected, and most revolvers are also corrected by stretching the gas ring. That's this piece right here. Now on the Ruger, it's part of the cylinder. And Ruger cylinders are harder than, really hard. If you have a soft gas ring, they stretch pretty easy and there's nothing to it. On the Ruger, it's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of work on your part. You need to put a base pin in here or a drill or something that's just precisely that size. Now I have a hardened tapered plug that I drive into it so it's a good tight fit. Then I put it in a gas ring stretcher, which I have made and which I think that you will be able to buy shortly from Catco. You put it in the gas ring stretcher with the plug in it, and then you turn the cylinder and screw it in, and what you're doing is driving a hardened steel plate into the gas ring right here, and the plug keeps it from collapsing. And you turn, tighten it, turn, tighten, and you'll force that into the gas ring, making a groove. Well, if it can't collapse on the inside because the steel plug is in it, it has to get longer. That's what you're doing, is you're extending the gas ring. You can also do it if you have a good vise with smooth jaws by putting oil on it, and I have to lubricate it, but you put oil on it here. You put a piece of good quality spring stock that you can get from Brownells here, and you squeeze the vise on it just a little bit and rotate it, a little tighter and rotate it, a little tighter and rotate it, and you will drive the spring into the gas ring. On a Ruger, believe me, you'll probably wreck your vise before you get it stretched very much. On most guns, that'll work. The gas rings are softer. The Ruger cylinders are very, very hard. There's a difference of opinion on how a cylinder should be. Colt and Smith cylinders are basically softer than a Ruger cylinder. Some people say that a Ruger is stronger because I can blow up a Smith & Wesson or a Colt with a lighter load than I can a Ruger. Dumb thing to even think, but what their philosophy is that as the pressure builds up and you start using hotter and hotter loads, the cylinder will flex or give and will stretch and will bulge until you can't extract the cases before you reach a load hot enough to actually blow it up. But they do blow up, and people do it all the time. The Rugers are very hard, and they will show no signs of pressure, no swelling, or rarely do they have any signs of pressure or swelling until they get so powerful, so much internal pressure inside the loaded round that the cylinder simply bursts. So that the Ruger will actually handle a hotter load than a Smith or a Colt without showing signs of distress. You'll ruin a Colt or Smith cylinder with a lower pressure than you will a Ruger. But the Ruger won't give you much warning. When it fails, it fails, but you're way over the max by the time you do it. So I guess you could say that yes, a Ruger will handle a hotter load than a Smith or a Colt, and that is true. But when the Smith or Colt fail, they usually fail a little milder fashion than the Ruger, because the Ruger held until the pressure is so high that it's going to do something. So just because your Ruger will hold more powder and not blow up doesn't mean you should be using more powder. So you should be using factory equivalent loads, even though you think the Ruger will handle more. Anyway, you want to have 2/1000ths or less of end shake, and you do take it out by stretching the gas ring. Caution, of course, you must use a plug in the hole so you won't collapse the gas ring, and then you have to ream it so you can get the base pin back through it. You get it down to 0 to 2, it's good enough. Now in reality, if you have 3 or 4, you don't have to fix it. But bear in mind that the more end shake you have, the more the cylinder flops back and forth every time you shoot it, and that beating shortens the ratchet pads, beats out the frame on both ends, and shortens the gas ring to boot. So when you finally take it out and fix the end shake, it's going to take a lot more work to do it. So you're better off to just keep it within spec. So if you're going to do a lot of work on Rugers, then I think you probably want a gas ring stretcher. Or else get a good vise and be prepared to fresh up the jaws every now and then. Now you saw this cylinder in here, and when it was in the window, it was floppy. It flopped back and forth. But look, see, someone's fiddled with the cylinder stops, and they have made it very sloppy in the hole. Now if we put in a new cylinder stop that's wider, that would take care of almost all of that side slop. You want the cylinder stop to be as wide as the hole and also as wide as the notches. And if it's, let's say that the hole in the frame, the window in the frame from the cylinder stop is 100/1000ths, the cylinder stop's 99 thousandths, and the slot in the cylinder for the ball of the stop is 110 thousandths, you're going to have 11 thousandths slop, aren't you? Not a whole lot you can do about it unless you want to open up the hole in the frame or the window in the frame for the cylinder stop and make an oversized, wider cylinder stop. A lot of effort. Frankly, you can probably live with 11 thousandths if you had to. But in this case, putting in a new cylinder stop would take care of most of that. And if we were for real, then we would put in a new cylinder stop. They usually require no fitting. Drop in and they'll time up. It's amazing how Ruger has developed this gun or designed this gun so that it doesn't take a whole lot of handwork to make it work. You put in a new part and it will pretty much function most of the time. All right, now the timing, and we looked at that earlier, but we'll show you again. The hand timing is off. It's cocked, now it's locked up. Now you want it to be cocked and locked up at the same time. I did that fast, so I do it on purpose. Lots of times you want a trigger job done on your Ruger single action, and the Rugers tend to have a negative sear system. That means that when you pull the trigger very carefully, the hammer will creep forward slightly before it actually falls. See that creep forward a little bit? See that move? See that movement? Oops, that fell, but see it? There we go. See the hammer cam back. When I pull it slightly, the hammer falls forward. That's a negative sear system. The full cock notch and or the trigger sear itself are negative, so that they want to disengage rather than stay engaged. They rely to a large extent on friction and spring tension to hold them in place. It allows a lighter feeling trigger pull, but if you're going to lighten the trigger pull, you must correct that. So if you want to do a trigger job on this type of a gun, I suggest that you buy the course on the trigger pulls. It'll keep you out of trouble, because if you start lightening springs or chopping down engagement, you're going to have a problem. So just don't until you know what you're doing. If you don't know what you're doing or don't want to buy the tapes, take it to a really qualified gunsmith and get the trigger job done so that you know it's safe. Another thing I'm going to bring up is that Bill Ruger was a smart man, and he employed smart people in his design. And mind you, Bill Ruger, I think, is largely responsible for the design of this gun. Now, I don't know what your IQ is, but I think Bill's is right up there in genius. And you see these kits, performance kits, quote, quote, that you can buy to put in your Ruger to make it a wonder gun. These guys, some of them are pretty smart, I suppose, and some of them just think they are, and they come out with a spring kit to make a few bucks on. Frankly, you get the guns out of balance, and they're in most cases not as safe or as good as they were before you started. I would say leave the Ruger springs in the Ruger gun. The only guy whose spring kits I even give a minor nod of approval to are the Wolf spring kits. The old boy knows what he's doing, and he's thought it out a lot more so than most of the people who sell various spring kits. So if you have to put in a spring kit, and I don't recommend it, get a Wolf. Leave the other ones alone. You're just wasting your money. When they come into my shop and they have somebody else's spring kits in them, Ruger springs go back in. I'm sorry, folks, it's the way it are. So for the trigger job, get the tape or take it to a professional that really knows what he's doing. The end shake, be prepared to grunt and work, and I would suggest that you buy a gas ring stretcher. Now, we have the two problems with the gun. We have the rotational play because of the sloppy cylinder stop, and we have slow timing because of the slightly short hand. Now, if I were going to do this for real, I would put in a new cylinder stop and take out most of this rotational play, and then I would time it up. I'm just going to time it now because I don't have a cylinder stop for this model with me, and it's just a matter of putting it in. Normally you'd have no fitting with it at all. So next time you see the gun, I'm going to have it apart and have the hand out. We have the hand out of the gun, and they vary somewhat in hardness and their ductility. So as a matter of safety, I recommend that you partially anneal the hands before you actually start to stretch them. And I have a MAP gas torch here. And I'm going to anneal it. I'm going to heat the hand up until it turns blue. If it's a stainless steel one, heat it up until it turns light brown. Yeah, turned it blue. Now soften it up like a spring. It's still hard, not real easy to bend, but it won't break as easy as it used to. When it cools off, then I'll stretch it. I stretch it by laying it on a hard, flat steel surface, putting a punch on it sideways and hitting it with a big hammer. And I'll do that in just a minute as soon as it cools off. The hand is cooled down, and now if I can touch it, I put it on the vise, which has a hard, flat surface. I lay a large punch across it like this. And hit it several times, and you can see that I have some little wobbles in it. I'm going to put some more deeper dents in it, but that's right on the right track at least. Then I take the hammer, I usually take a smaller one, and I that pounds out my dents so they're not so obvious that I've been mistreating it. And the hand also curls slightly. And as long as it'll be free in the window, I like a slight curl because it's like making the hand a little bit longer. It times up better that way. So if it's really curly, I'll straighten it out once or twice by hitting it that way. But a little curl in it, as long as it works free in the hand window, in the frame, I don't care if it's got a little curl in it. I think it's better. Well, I put the gun back together so we can test it. I cock it. I slight drag on the cylinder with my thumb. It's cocked. It's locked. They fall in simultaneously. And while I had it apart, I noticed that the cylinder stop spring and plunger were in upside down, so I put it back in right, and that pushed the cylinder stop up a bit higher. We've taken out most of the play in the cylinder when the gun is cocked. Probably 2/3 of it's out of it now. So what's left, of course, is the fact that the cylinder stop is loose in the window, and that's where most of that play is coming from there. I was lucky. I stretched the hand once and put it in and tried it, and it was right. Don't count on that, but remember, I've stretched thousands of them, so I've kind of got a feel for how much is too much and how much is not enough. And I was lucky. It usually takes me 2 tries, but this time I got it in 1. Sometimes it takes me 4 or 5. It just depends on how good I am, I guess. Anyway, for you, you hit it, try it, hit it, and try it. It might take you all day to time your first one, but you'll get the hang of it. You will get the hang of it, and it gets a little bit easier. That's a fairly easy fix, and timing is a relatively common ailment. The 2 most common, of course, is the broken hammer plunger and timing and end shake, but they don't develop end shake that fast because the cylinders are so hard. Other than that, most of the problems that encounter with the gun is induced by someone taking it apart and putting it back together wrong. Remember too that the base pin has a spring-loaded plunger in it that pushes the safety back. And sometimes that plunger comes out and gets lost or tries to get lost. And if you can't find the parts and stake them back in, then just buy a new base pin assembly. And the base pins come pretty much per model. So a Blackhawk takes one, Super Blackhawk takes one, the short barrel Blackhawks take another one, and the 22 calibers take another one. Old model, new model both take a different one. So you got to remember exactly what you got when you order a base pin. I've mentioned that the cylinder stop is pretty much of a drop-in affair, and by making the hammer plunger longer, you can make the cylinder stop start down sooner. But that's really probably all you need to do on them. Most of the time you take a new cylinder stop and drop in the gun and it works. It just gets in and times up good enough. If you want perfection, then yeah, you'd have to time it precisely. But they come surprisingly close on a Ruger, right out of the box. So if you buy a new part, put it in, the chances are it will not need any fitting. But you know how to get it down sooner, and that's the biggest problem you'd have with it. You know that if the hammer plunger is too long, it'll catch in the front of the cylinder stop's tail, stop the hammer from falling. You know at this point how to time the cylinder, you know at this time how to time the hand. We don't have too many problems with the distance between the first and second stage of the hand unless someone has filed it off and made it too short. And then, frankly, unless you have a TIG welder, the best thing to do is just replace the hand with a new one. If you want to know how to precisely fit and time the hand on the Ruger, then get the Colt single action tape. That was made for cowboy action shooting, and it goes into vast detail on how to fit a hand. The Ruger and the Colt hand, for all intents and purposes, are the same. They'd be fitted and timed up the same way. But you notice that it's relatively simple, a small stretch, and I took a lot of the slop out of it and took a lot of the slow timing out of it. You notice that it's more than a 1/16, but well under a quarter that it was before. And it does time up even with drag on the cylinder. As soon as it falls in the full cock, trigger falls in the full cock notch, the ball of the stop has gone into the cylinder. So it's timed correctly. If you time them real tight and cock them fast, you're going to beat up the cylinder stop. So a single action can afford to be slightly slower than a double action gun. I like to make them the same, but if it's not quite timed up perfectly on a single action, it's going to lock up. But this one was way too slow. As far as doodads for Rugers, like I said, Bill did a good job when he came up with this gun. And I don't think there's much you can do unless you get serious about fast draw or serious about cowboy action shooting. For the general guy, this gun's pretty darn good out of the box. And about all I would do probably is a good trigger pull by someone who's knowledgeable, or learn how to do it yourself, and a scope or other optical sight or a red dot sight of some kind might be handy, especially when you're my age and you can't see the rear sight anymore. It's good to have a good sight on it. I haven't talked about tuning the guns up for cowboy action shooting, and of course the Ruger Vaquero was made just for that type of stuff. I'm not a cowboy action shooter. Frankly, couldn't do it because of lead poisoning for a good many years, and now that I can, I don't have the time. So I'm not an expert on that area. There are people who are, and if you really want to know how to tune your gun for cowboy action shooting, I suggest that you get a video on how to do it, a good one, not just going to hit the high spots, but get a good one and play with your gun yourself. I know the guy who has made one or two, and he knows what he's doing. He'll do a good job for you, and that's what I suggest. I haven't touched on it because of those reasons. I know the gun well, and I can tune it and maintain it for sporting use, but for serious cowboy action shooting, the tuning is different, and I would recommend that you get that tape by a real professional and study it and do it, or have it done by a real professional. Frankly, it's so specialized, I would be tempted to just have a real pro, do it to your gun for action cowboy shooting. You probably don't need to have it done until you start getting pretty good, and then you need the edge, and then pay the money and have it done. It's been fun. I do like the guns, and they brought the single actions back to the United States, or back to America. Actually, Ruger brought the single action back to the world because there was a dead issue. A few people were buying original Colts or Colt percussions, and there were a few copies available of the old percussion guns. But Ruger came out with an inexpensive, strong, workable single action gun, and everybody wanted to have one. And of course, Colt brought it back after that, brought their old gun, and it's pretty successful for them. And of course, there's a couple of Italian firms that have sold, I'll bet you, millions of them, hundreds of thousands for sure. So the Ruger, I should say, the single action is back, has made a comeback, and Bill Ruger and Sturm Ruger Company is responsible for that. They brought the single action back to the world. Actually, I'm glad they did. They're fun to shoot. Hope you have fun with yours, and I'll talk to you later.